Well, on Easter weekend, we began this series called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, and we've been using a book by the same title to kind of inform a lot of the discussion we've been having. And we're having this discussion really because as we look at cultural trends, we see that atheism and spiritual skepticism are on the rise, that many, more and more people are saying, you know, I'm an atheist or I'm a spiritual skeptic because it's a new way of maybe saying that I'm enlightened, or maybe it's what the cool kids are doing these days, or maybe many of us just think that because of science and scientific advances, that those scientific advances have disproven God, or at the very least, because of how far we've come, we don't need God anymore. And so we've been having this conversation because a lot of folks just haven't taken the time to look at the evidence for God. We don't believe that there is evidence for God, and so maybe we don't look at it. And so we've been looking at the evidence, and what we found is that there is overwhelming evidence for the existence of God. As a matter of fact, it takes more faith to be an atheist and believe he doesn't exist than to believe he actually does exist. And what we have seen, and we saw in week 1, is that God invites investigation. That God doesn't expect us just to believe in him just with blind faith, but that he gives evidence, and he asks us to use our reason and to use our brains to look at the evidence and to see that he is. And we saw in week 1 that Jesus actually gave evidence that would confirm that he is who he said he was. As a matter of fact, he said the resurrection would be the greatest sign that he was who he said he was. And he told not only his followers, but he told his skeptics, and he told those who would go on to eventually kill him. He said, you're going to kill me, but come into my grave 3 days later, because I'm going to come out of the grave alive, and then you will know I am who I said that I am. He knew we would need evidence to believe, and so he gave it to us. He invites us to investigate. But the resurrection isn't the only evidence that we're able to look at objectively to see the fact that God is. Over the last 4 weeks, we've been looking at scientific evidence, evidence in the natural world that points to the fact that God exists. The very fact that the universe has a beginning means that something, or more accurately, someone, had to cause the beginning of the universe. And we call this the Cosmological Argument. If you're with us, the Cosmological Argument, you may remember it goes like this. Everything that had a beginning has a cause. This is the law of causation. You can't do science without the law of causation. Stuff doesn't just happen without a cause. If it has a beginning, it has a cause. The universe had a beginning. We saw this very clearly from Einstein's theory of general relativity to the Big Bang theory to all the evidence that has been shown that there was a singularity event when all time and space and matter kind of came into being. And so therefore, that had to have a cause. Therefore, the universe, point 3, had a cause. It was at the beginning of space and time and matter and energy. As all that came into existence, it means that someone outside of space and time and energy had to cause that. That would be someone who would have to be personal. It would have to be all-powerful. They would have to be outside of time, so timeless. They would have to be immaterial or spiritual in order to create those things. And as we looked at how the universe is so finely tuned to be able to support life on this little speck of planet called Earth, as we looked at these constants in the universe, that without them, over 100 of them, there could be no life. And as we looked at how they're also finely tuned, and the chances that those constants would just occur by chance, that they're so remote that it's clearly miraculous that there is life on our planet. And we call this a teleological argument. The teleological argument is stated like this: every design has a designer. Stuff doesn't just get designed, especially in the natural world. In the natural world, things go from order to disorder, not from disorder to order. So if something has a design, it must have a designer. Number 2, the universe has highly complex design. We see this fine-tuning of the universe. Therefore, the universe has a designer. We then moved on to the origin of life argument. And we saw that life clearly had a beginning on our planet, but there's no natural explanation of where that first life came from. We saw Darwin didn't even attempt to answer that question of where that first life came from. Where did it begin? Where did it come from? How did these irreducibly complex systems in living beings just spontaneously come into being with every part in place and put in order the way it needed to be able to support life? What we saw is that because this was statistically impossible to happen by natural causes, it makes the most logical sense that the same being who caused the universe and fine-tuned the universe to support life was also the origin for life on our planet. And then last week we looked at the last argument for the existence of God, the moral argument. And while not the most compelling of all the arguments, it's also an important part of understanding the fact that God is, and the moral argument goes like this. Every law has a lawgiver, right? There is no law without some legislator. Someone's got to write the law, give the law. There is a moral law. We know this. We know the difference between good and evil. Some things are evil. Some things are good. Therefore, there must be a moral law. Therefore, there must be a moral lawgiver. Therefore, God must exist. And if you missed any of these arguments, again, you can go to our website, and they're available there in audio or video format. But the point is, as you put all of these arguments together, we can know God exists beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's where we started off saying, to prove God's existence beyond a reasonable doubt. We can't prove such things with 100% certainty. Just as we can't prove that he isn't with 100% certainty, we're dealing in the realm of probability. But beyond a reasonable doubt, we can know that God exists, which means that any other explanation for how the universe began, or is so finely tuned, or where life came from, or why there is morality, any other explanation is frankly unreasonable, because God has been demonstrated through the evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. And not only does the scientific and philosophical evidence demonstrate that God is beyond a reasonable doubt, it also demonstrates what he is like. We've been able to look at the evidence and say, well, based on the evidence and how things are created and how things came into order, we can start to take that evidence and see what this God must be like. And we saw that God must be personal, because he was making a conscious choice from outside of the created order to create the created order in nature and energy and matter, and to fine-tune the universe. All those things had to be done consciously by a personal being. He must be supremely powerful to be able to orchestrate a singularity event or a big bang or to start the universe. He must be supremely powerful or supremely intelligent as well to be able to fine-tune the universe, to be able to support life and all the factors that would need to interplay. He must be unimaginably creative in order to see the diversity and the variety of life that we have on this planet. He must be unimaginably creative. And because of the moral law, he must be morally good, because he is the source of morality, and he is the one who asks us to be moral beings. While these characteristics that we see from God, they align well with the story we read about God in the Bible. We didn't come at these things from the Bible, but we came at them from looking at the evidence in the natural world, from science and philosophy. But these characteristics about God, they also begin to give us a clue as to which religious worldview makes the most sense and is the most reasonable. And stay with me here, because we're kind of turning a corner from demonstrating God's existence to start to look at what does God's existence and the characteristic of God, what does it say about our religious worldview? And if we could simplify the different worldviews of religion on our planet, we could probably summarize them into three, and the first might be theism. Theism is just the worldview or the belief that there is a personal, all-powerful, all-knowing God who created the universe, but is not a part of the created order. He's outside of it. That doesn't mean he's not interactive with it, but he's outside of it. And so the religions that would be considered to be theistic would be Christianity, Islam, and Judaism. Okay, that's some of the biggest, theism is one of the biggest worldviews on our planet. Another one would be pantheism. Pantheism is the belief in an impersonal God, that God literally is the universe. In other words, God and the universe are one. God is in everything, and God is everything. God is the universe. God is the grass. God is the tree. God is the water. God is the stars. This God is impersonal, or doesn't have a personality. God is more like a force or an energy, kind of like the Force in Star Wars, right? And so religions that would be considered pantheistic would be Hinduism, some forms of Buddhism, and then the New Age movement. And then a third major world religion, maybe not major, but a third worldview would be the atheistic worldview that would say there is no God, the natural world is all there is, everything is just cause and effect in the natural realm. God is not in play because he doesn't exist. Another term we've been using throughout the series is the term agnosticism or agnostic. And this is a worldview that just says, we can't know whether there's a God or not. I mean, I'm just going to stay on the fence. I'm not going to say there is. I'm not going to say there isn't. We just really can't know. Well, as we look at these major religious worldviews or these worldviews on religion, Can we, based on what we've discovered about God from science and philosophy and the natural world, begin to say which one is most reasonable and which ones maybe we can rule out? And the answer is yes. This isn't a popular thing to do, but I mean, let's just use our heads. We could probably, remove atheism because we've demonstrated beyond a reasonable doubt that God does exist. But you're like, well, what about agnosticism? Can we really get rid of agnosticism, the people who say, I don't know? And I would say, well, I think so, because saying I don't know is something that is reserved until we have enough evidence to make a decision. It's not a state we stay in forever. Well, I just don't know. I mean, there's some things maybe we could stay in that state for forever, like what happened to the dinosaurs. Okay, I don't know. Maybe we'll never figure that out. But, I mean, is the world round or is it flat? I mean, there was a time when we could have said we don't know. But now enough evidence has been gathered that we need to move off of the fence on that and say, I'm going to commit. Yes, the world is round. I mean, there's enough evidence. There's enough evidence for the existence of God that agnosticism eventually has to come to a decision point and say, you know what? The evidence is there. I'm either going to decide that he does exist and I'm going to follow him or I'm not. Right? But the evidence is there. Also, we could remove pantheism because we know that God is a personal God. Again, God and the universe cannot be one because the universe had a beginning and needed a cause. If God and the universe are one, therefore we're back to the question of what caused the universe. A personal God from outside of the universe had to start the universe. And so there, again, pantheism is probably not the most reasonable. That leaves us with theism, or this belief that there is one all-powerful God who created all things but is outside the created order. Are you with me? Okay. So the question then is, well, is there any way to tell which of these religions are the right religions or contain the most truth or are the most reasonable? And again, I know that I'm treading on very culturally explosive grounds here because we don't ever want to say anybody is wrong or anybody is right, because truth is relative and all those things. And let me just be very clear. We're not talking about which religion has all of the truth and all the other religions have all wrong. Because I believe all of these religions certainly have truth in them. And all these religions have good in them. One doesn't have a corner on the truth market. But as you begin to look at these religious worldviews within theism, you see that many of them make contradictory truth claims, which means that they can't all be right. Based on the law of non-contradiction, two truth claims that are in total contradiction with one another cannot both be right. For instance, the basic foundational belief of Christianity is that Jesus rose from the grave. He was crucified for our sins, rose 3 days later, right? The resurrection. Muslims believe that Jesus went to the cross, but he never died. Okay? Those are two contradictory truth claims. They can't both be right. So the question is, how do we begin to determine which is right and which is wrong? Is this something that we just accept by blind faith? Is it something that we just accept by preference? Well, I grew up as Christian or I grew up as Muslim, so I'm going to accept whatever my tradition says. I would say, no. We can investigate which is right by evaluating each of these claims against the historical evidence. We can use a scientific method with every one of these truth claims to say which is more reasonable, which is true, which isn't true. Well, you may wonder, well, how can we investigate something that happened 2,000 years ago? A guy who died on a cross? I mean, can we even know that Jesus existed? Isn't he just a myth? I mean, isn't this just a product of legend? And many would say, spiritual skeptics would say, don't take me to the New Testament to prove that Jesus existed because I don't even believe the New Testament is accurate or authoritative. So how can we investigate these things? And these are common objections, and they're valid. But what I want to do with the rest of our time this morning is to really address two questions to kind of build a foundation for where we're going to go over the next 2 weeks. And these are the two questions. Was Jesus a real person? And the New Testament, I want to make the point, the New Testament is a 2,000-year-old historically reliable source. First, consider this first question. Was Jesus a real person? Now, there aren't many people left around who don't really believe Jesus was a real person who lived 2,000 years ago. But in case you're one of them, or in case you know one of them, or someday meet one of them, let's just cover this quickly, the existence of Jesus. Consider the writings of Flavius Josephus. Flavius Josephus was a Jew, one of the premier, the preeminent Jewish historians of the first several centuries. He was a Jew. He wrote for the Roman Emperor Domitian in the 1st century AD. He wrote a lot of the Roman history, but also he wrote a lot of the Jewish history. He wrote a work called The Antiquities of the Jews, which was published, or he finished in 93 AD. Josephus was not a Christian. He was Jewish, but he was not a Christian. But as he was writing about the history of his people, the Jews, he couldn't help but write about the eventful life and death of this person, Jesus of Nazareth. In one place, Josephus, again, this premier Jewish historian who was not a Christian, remember that, he wrote this about Jesus. He said, at this time, and the context is the time of Pilate, the guy who crucified Jesus, there was a wise man who was called Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and the other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. Accordingly, he was perhaps the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets have recounted wonders. So, again, here we have this Jewish man who is an official historian for the Romans, not a believer in Jesus, but he's giving us details about the life of Jesus, and he's writing some 50 or 60 years after the life of Jesus, so it's very credible. And he's giving us details not only about the life of Jesus, but he'll go on to give many more details about Jesus' life, and also the rest of the New Testament. Many of the historical facts that the New Testament writes about, Josephus will confirm. And Josephus isn't the only non-Christian, non-biblical writer from the 1st and 2nd century to write about the life of Jesus. Did you know there are actually 10 non-Christian sources that mention Jesus within 150 years of his life? These are writers outside of the Bible. These are not biblical writers outside of the Bible who write about the fact that Jesus existed. You may not think, well, that's not many. 10? But compare this to the fact that there are only 9 non-Christian writers who mention Tiberius Caesar, who was the emperor during the time that Jesus was alive. It's pretty remarkable that a guy, a no-name peasant who lived in the outskirts of the Roman Empire, gets more written about him than the emperor at the time that he is alive. And when you begin to add in the Christian writers who wrote about both of these guys in the 1st century and early 2nd century, it's not even close. Jesus gets 43, Caesar gets 10. If this is a competition, Jesus is winning, right? But it's not a competition. But there are 43 writers who write about Jesus in the 1st and early 2nd century, only 10 who write about Tiberius Caesar. And many of these sources are not only non-Christian, many of them are anti-Christian. These are like polemics against Christianity. But what's interesting is none of what they write about in the 1st and early 2nd century contradict anything that's written about Jesus or the beginning of the New Testament church that's written in the New Testament. As a matter of fact, if we were to get rid of the New Testament altogether, let's say the New Testament was like lost in the 1st century and we never saw it. If we just took the non-Christian sources that wrote about Jesus, we would be able to put together a storyline of the life of Jesus that very closely mirrors what we get from the New Testament. These are things that we're able to learn about the life of Jesus just from 1st century writers who were non-Christian writing about him in that 1st century. Number 1, Jesus lived during the reign of Tiberius Caesar. 2, he lived a virtuous life. 3, he was a wonder worker. He had a brother named James. That's an interesting detail there. 5, he was considered to be the Messiah. 6, he was crucified under Pilate. 7, he was crucified on the eve of the Jewish Passover. 8, darkness and an earthquake occurred when he died. This is being confirmed from outside of the Bible, non-Christian writers. His disciples believed he rose from the dead. 10, his disciples were willing to die for their belief. 11, Christianity spread rapidly as far as Rome. And 12, his disciples would renounce the Roman gods and worship Jesus as the Son of God. I mean, this is truly remarkable. This is a storyline we put together about the life of Jesus from non-Christian sources taken from the 1st and early 2nd century. So based on the evidence, there's no question whether Jesus was an actual person. We can know beyond a reasonable doubt that Jesus definitely was a person who lived 2,000 years ago. But what about the stories about him? Were they true? I mean, okay, yeah, so he existed. how do we know he is who he said he was? Or, is the New Testament an accurate and historical account of his life and his death and his resurrection? I'd like to cover that next, that question. Is the New Testament a historically reliable source? And just let's be clear. We're not talking yet about, is it the Word of God? Which I believe it is, and I think most of you probably believe it is. We're just saying, is it historically reliable and accurate? We'll get to the Word of God in future weeks. But is it historically reliable? So I just want to make the point that the New Testament is a 2,000-year-old historically reliable source. And this is really in response to two of the main objections about the New Testament that spiritual skeptics will bring up. And the first is that, it wasn't really written in the first century. And this has been popularized by books like the Da Vinci Codes and other things. It wasn't really written in the first century. The idea is that it was written much later, the 3rd, 4th, 5th century. Lots of time went on after Jesus lived so that fables and legend and myth could kind of enter into the story before it was eventually written down. And so people say there's no way it was written in the first century. Was it? Well, before we get to that, just a quick side note on the New Testament. A lot of times we think of the New Testament being just one document or one source. But the New Testament is actually a combination, a collection of 27 different books or different sources written by a variety of people in a variety of contexts over a period of a few decades. And so we're not talking about just one book. We're talking about a collection of books. But when was this collection of books written? Was it written close to the actual events in which they describe? Because that would be important so that fable and myth and legend could not enter into the story, like skeptics claim. Well, we can know beyond a reasonable doubt that the New Testament was written not only during the first century, the first 100 years, and Jesus was crucified and resurrected in 33 AD. And so if it was written in the first century, that would put it somewhere in the 65-year time frame since his death. But we can also know certainly that all of it was written before 70 AD, or within about 35 years of his death. And there's plenty of evidence to support the fact that most of it was written before 62 AD, and much of it was written much closer, probably around 40 to 45 AD, or 10 or 15 years after his death. How do we know this? Well, first we know this from some of the writings of the early church fathers. Between 95 and 110, there were church fathers, guys like Polycarp and Clement and Ignatius, these church leaders who we have their writings and we know they're dated between 95 and 110. And in them, these church fathers quote 25 of the 27 New Testament books. The only two that didn't quote were Jude and 2nd John, two very small books. So we know that those books of the New Testament had to be written by this time period, the first century. But actually, we could know they were written much earlier, probably, almost certainly, before 70 AD. How do we know the Bible, the New Testament, was written that early? Imagine with me, you're a Jew living in the first century. The center of your world, your economic world, your religious world, your social world is Jerusalem, and the temple in Jerusalem. It's been that way for 1,000 years, since the time of King David. You believe that Jerusalem is the city of God, and that in the temple, that is the dwelling place of God Most High. He lives there. And so this is like heaven on earth. Your life revolves around Jerusalem and the temple. Now, Jesus is recorded as saying in Matthew chapter 24, speaking just before his death in 33 AD, he gives a prophecy saying, watch out, because this city and this temple that you love so much are going to be destroyed. They're going to be flattened by the Romans. And he gave them warnings, signs to look for so that they could escape the city and not lose their lives. He spoke of this time in the future when it would all be gone. And history tells us that prophecy was fulfilled in 70 AD when the Roman army, under the leadership of their future emperor, Titus, came in and completely flattened and destroyed the city. They sacked it. The temple was completely flattened. The walls of the city was burned. This was the most cataclysmic event in the history of the Jews. And the Romans, in flattening the temple, it meant that this is the end of their way of life. This is the the end of their way of worship forever. More than that, the Roman historian Josephus, who we just quoted a moment ago, says that over 1 million civilian deaths occurred when they attacked Jerusalem. This was cataclysmic, the biggest, most significant tragedy in the history of the Jewish people. To this day, Jews still go to the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, which is the only remaining part of the western wall of the temple, and they weep over the loss that they suffered 2,000 years ago when Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. But here's the thing, not one of the writers in the New Testament, all of whom were Jewish, mention the destruction of Jerusalem or the temple in the New Testament. Now, if you're writing after 70 AD, aren't you going to at least mention this national and religious tragedy, especially considering the fact that Jesus, your Messiah, predicted it? It's going to kind of give him some credibility. Of course you are. But the fact no one does. As a matter of fact, every one of them write as though the temple and Jerusalem are still there. Because they are. Because they're writing these documents before Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD. And we could point to many other lines of evidence that actually support dates much earlier than 70, like manuscripts that have been found, again, in 40, 45, 50 AD. But the point is clear. The New Testament was written early, very close to the events that they were describing, which means that there couldn't have been any kind of a myth or legend to kind of enter into the story because eyewitnesses were still alive who can kind of give credibility or verify stories. The second most common objection to the New Testament is whether or not it was copied and preserved accurately. And this is really common. I understand this. People say, okay, well, it was written early, it was written close to the actual events, but it wasn't copied well, it wasn't preserved well. Lots of error, lots of myth has entered as it was copied over the centuries. And we think about that old party game, telephone, where you whisper a message into someone's ear, and then they whisper into someone's ear, and it goes down the line. It gets to the 10th person. It doesn't sound anything like the original message, and we're like, that's what the Bible is like, right? And I understand this objection. It makes sense on the surface. That the Bible would have started pure and ended up all corrupt. The first point we need to be clear on is the fact that all we have of the New Testament or any of the Bible are copies. We don't have any original manuscripts from John or Mark or Paul. None of those have been found. If they still exist, we haven't found them yet, or maybe they've been destroyed. All we have are copies. And skeptics will quickly point to this fact and say, you know what, see? How can you trust a copy? How do you know it is what the original intended to say? But we need to realize that's all we have of any ancient document are copies. I mean, manuscripts just don't survive that long. All we have are copies of Plato or Aristotle, Homer, the Roman historians, the history of Rome, all of that. We only have copies. So then the question is, how do we know what we can trust out of those copies? What makes one more credible than the other? How do we reconstruct the originals? And there's two things that are really needed. First of all, you need a lot of copies. The more copies you have of the original, the better. Because that means you could use many copies to kind of cross-reference one another and look for any kind of variant readings or mistakes or errors that may have been added. The more copies you have, the better, the more credible you can know that you have what the original intended to say. And the second thing you really need is a short time gap between the time of the original and the copy. In other words, if you only have a couple decades between the time of the copy and the original, that's good, versus like it's 1,000 years between the original and the copy. You don't know what's happened in that 1,000 years, so you want a shorter time gap. So how does the New Testament kind of stack up to the standard? Well, compared to other writings of antiquity, there is no comparison. First, let's just consider the number of manuscripts that have been found of the New Testament documents. Here's a graph you can see. The New Testament, over 5,600 manuscripts of the New Testament have been found. The next closest of antiquity would be Homer's Iliad at 643, and you can kind of go down the line and see, Caesar's, the history of Caesar is 10, Plato 7, Pliny 7. The funny thing is we don't really question the authenticity of these works or of the Roman history or what happened with the emperors. We just take that on faith, but we only have a handful of copies of the originals. But you look at the New Testament, 5,600 copies have been found. We have so many copies that we can have total confidence that the New Testament we have accurately communicates what the original meant to communicate as well. What about the time gap between originals and the copies we've discovered. Again, the New Testament is second to none in ancient documents. The time gap between the originals and the copies for many of the books of the New Testament is a mere 25 years. 25 years. And we have manuscripts that are nearly complete New Testament books that date to about 200 AD, which would put it about 130 years after it was written. And again, compared to other, here's where you want a short line. You want a short time gap. The New Testament, 25 years. Homer's Iliad, 500 years between the original and the copy. That's the next closest in terms of ancient documents. And so, here's the thing. Even if we didn't know that the New Testament was well preserved through copying and the manuscripts that we have, we would still be able to know with confidence that the New Testament that we have has been accurately preserved. How do we know that? Because of the writings of the ancient fathers that have been well preserved as well. Did you know that in the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century, there are these church fathers, these guys who would write about theology, and they would write to the different churches, guys like Justin Martyr and Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, Ignatius. And in their writings, that you can go down to the local library and check out, they quote the New Testament over 36,000 times, which means we have almost the entire New Testament just in the writings of the ancient church fathers. So again, if the New Testament had been lost back in 200 AD, we would still be able to reconstruct the New Testament just by the writings of the church fathers that you can go and read down at the Parker Library by checking out their works still today. So where does all this leave us? As we've seen over the last several weeks, we live in a theistic world. We live in a theistic universe. We can know God exists beyond a reasonable doubt. More than that, we can know beyond a reasonable doubt a man named Jesus lived 2,000 years ago, and there is an accurate historical account that has been meticulously preserved that tells us what he said and what he did. These are all reasonable truths supported by ample evidence. Now, next week, we're going to turn to the question of, but are those stories true? How can we know? Were there really eyewitnesses? How do we know they're telling the truth and not just making these things up? I think we're going to see next week and the week after, beyond a reasonable doubt, that they not only told the truth about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, but that because they did, Jesus is who he said he is. And that changes everything.